Fantastic Audio presents Earthlight and Other Stories. The collected stories of Arthur C. Clarke, 1949 to 1951. Performed by Christopher Casanov, Gabrielle de Cure, Samantha Egar, Artie Johnson, Roald Martinson, Stephen Memel, John Rubinson.
Had rather expected this. It gave him relatively little satisfaction to confirm the existence of an extremist movement inside the Freedom League. As a matter of interest, he said, "How did you kidnap me?" He hardly expected a reply and was taken aback by the other's readiness, even eagerness, to answer. Only slowly did he guess the reason. "It was all rather like one of those old Fritz Lang films," said Joe cheerfully. "We weren't sure if Karelin had a watch on you, so we took somewhat elaborate precautions. You were knocked out by gas in the air conditioner. That was easy. Then we carried you out into the car and drove off. No trouble at all. All this, I might say, wasn't done by any of our people. We hired professionals for the job. Karelin may get them. In fact, he's supposed to, but he'll be no wiser. When it left your house, the car drove into a long road tunnel, not 1,000 kilometers from New York. It came out again on schedule at the other end, still carrying a drugged man extraordinarily like the Secretary General. About the same time, a large truck loaded with metal cases emerged in the opposite direction and drove to a certain airfield where one of the cases was loaded aboard a freighter. Meanwhile, the car that had done the job continued elaborate evasive action in the general direction of Canada. Perhaps Karelin's caught it by now. I don't know. As you'll see, I do hope you appreciate my frankness. Our whole plan depended on one thing. We're pretty sure that Karelin can see and hear everything that happens on the surface of the Earth. But unless he uses magic, not science, he cannot see underneath it. So he won't know about the transfer in the tunnel. Naturally, we've taken a risk, but there were also one or two other stages in your removal, which I won't go into now. We may have to use them again one day, and it would be a pity to give them away." Joe had related the whole story with such obvious gusto that Stormgren found it difficult to be appropriately furious. Yet he felt disturbed. The plan was an ingenious one, and it seemed more than likely that whatever watch Karelin kept on him, he would have been tricked by this ruse. The Pole was watching Stormgren's reactions closely. He would have to appear confident, whatever his real feelings. "You must be a lot of fools," said Stormgren scornfully, "if you think you can trick the overlords like this. In any case, what conceivable good would it do of mankind? And not even the shock of recognition could undo that work." And Stormgren knew also that the last thing he would ever see as he closed his eyes on life would be that swiftly turning door and the long black tail disappearing behind it, a very famous and unexpectedly beautiful tale, a barbed tail.
Silence, please. First published in Science Fantasy, Winter 1950, as by Charles Willis. Collected in Tales from the White Heart.
Negative feedback noise eliminators are now on the market and already have many engineering applications. I recently purchased a pair of earphones that were supposed to eliminate ambient sound. However, I doubt if anything as versatile as the Fenton silencer will ever be on the market.
You come upon the White Hart quite unexpectedly in one of those anonymous little lanes leading down from Fleet Street to the embankment. It's no use telling you where it is. Very few people who have set out in a determined effort to get there have ever actually arrived. For the first dozen visits, a guide is essential. After that, you'll probably be all right if you close your eyes and rely on instinct. Also, to be perfectly frank, we don't want any more customers, at least Not on our night. The place is already uncomfortably crowded. All that I'll say about its location is that it shakes occasionally with a vibration of newspaper presses, and that if you crane out of the window of the gents' room, you can just see the Thames. From the outside, it looks like any other pub, as indeed it is for 5 days of the week. The public and saloon bars are on the ground floor. There are the usual vistas of brown oak panelling and frosted glass, the bottles behind the bar, the handles of the beer engines. Nothing out of the ordinary at all. Indeed, the only concession to the 20th century is the jukebox in the public bar. It was installed during the war in a laughable attempt to make GIs feel at home, and one of the first things we did was to make sure that there was no danger of its ever working again. At this point, I'd better explain who we are. That is not as easy as I thought it was going to be when I started, for a complete catalogue of the White Hart's clients would probably be impossible, and would certainly be excruciatingly tedious. So all I'll say at this point is that we are deprivation. Someone in the physics department must have realized the truth fairly promptly, for soon little slips of paper were circulating among the VIPs in the front row. The Vice-Chancellor was rash enough to try to restore order by sign language, waving frantically to the audience from the stage. By this time, I was too sick with laughter to appreciate such fine details. There was nothing for it but to get out of the hall, which we all did as quickly as we could. I think Kendall had fled. He was so overcome by the effect of the gadget that he didn't stop to switch it off. He was afraid of staying around in case he was caught and lynched. As for Fenton, alas, we shall never know his side of the story. We can only reconstruct the subsequent events from the evidence that was left. As I picture it, he must have waited until the hall was empty and then crept in to disconnect his apparatus. We heard the explosion all over the college. The explosion? Someone gasped. Well, of course, I shudder to think what a narrow escape we all had. Another dozen decibels, a few more FOMs, and it might have happened while the theatre was still packed. Regard it, if you like, as an example of the inscrutable workings of Providence that only the inventor was caught in the explosion. Perhaps it was as well. At least he perished in the moment of achievement, and before the dean could get at him. Stop moralizing, man. What happened? Well, I told you that Fenton was very weak on theory. If he had gone into the mathematics of the silencer, he'd have found his mistake. The trouble is, you see, that one can't destroy energy. Not even when you cancel out one train of waves by another. All that happens then is that the energy you've neutralized accumulates somewhere else. It's rather like sweeping up all the dirt in a room at the cost of an unsightly pile under the carpet. When you look into the theory of the thing, you'll find that Fenton's gadget wasn't a silencer so much as a collector of sound. All the time it was switched on, it was really absorbing sound energy. And at the concert, it was certainly going flat out. You'll understand what I mean if you've ever looked at one of Edward England's scores. On top of that, of course, there was all the noise the audience was making. Or I should say was trying to make during the resultant panic. The total amount of energy must have been terrific, and the poor silencer had to keep on sucking it up. Where did it go? Well, I don't know the circuit details, probably into the condensers of the power pack. And by the time Fenton started to tinker with it again, it was like a loaded bomb. The sound of his approaching footsteps was the last straw, and the overloaded apparatus could stand no more. It blew up. For a moment, no one said a word, perhaps as a token of respect for the late Mr. Fenton. Then Eric Main, who for the last 10 minutes had been muttering in the corner over his calculations, pushed his way through the ring of listeners. He held a sheet of paper thrust aggressively in front of him. "Hey," he said, "I was right all the time. The thing couldn't work. The phase and amplitude relations..." Purvis waved him away. "That's just what I've explained," he said patiently. "You should have been listening. Too bad that Fenton found out the hard way." He glanced at his watch. For some reason, he now seemed in a hurry to leave. My goodness, time's getting on. One of these days, remind me to tell you about the extraordinary thing we saw through the new proton microscope. That's an even more remarkable story. He was halfway through the door before anyone else could challenge him. Then George Whitley recovered his breath. Look here, he said in a perplexed voice. How is it that we never heard about this business? Purvis paused on the threshold, his pipe now burbling briskly as it got into its stride once more. He glanced back over his shoulder. There was only one thing to do, he replied. We didn't want a scandal. De mortuis nil nisi bonum, you know. Besides, in the circumstances, don't you think it was highly appropriate to, hush the whole business up? And a very good night to you all.
A Walk in the Dark. First appeared in Thrilling Wonder Stories, August 1950. Collected in Reach for Tomorrow.
Robert Armstrong had walked just over 2 miles, as far as he could judge, when his torch failed. He stood still for a moment, unable to believe that such a misfortune could really have befallen him. Then, half maddened with rage, he hurled the useless instrument away. It landed somewhere in the darkness, disturbing the silence of this little world. A metallic echo came ringing back from the low hills. Then all was quiet again. This, thought Armstrong, was the ultimate misfortune. Nothing more could happen to him now. He was even able to laugh bitterly at his luck, and resolved never again to imagine that the fickle goddess had ever favored him. Who would have believed that the only tractor at Camp 4 would have broken down when he was just setting off for Port Sanderson? He recalled the frenzied repair than a fading nightmare. It seemed terribly unfair. So little time. Such a small fraction of a human life was all he needed now. But the gods have always been unfair to man, and now they were enjoying their little jest. For there could be no mistaking the rattle of monstrous claws in the darkness ahead of him.
Holiday on the Moon. First appeared in Eris magazine, January, April, 1951.
This story was the result of arm-twisting by a charming lady editor for a magazine for young ladies, Eris. It was published as a 4-part serial, January to April 1951, as by Charles Willis. After half a century, I can't remember why I used the pseudonym. Perhaps I was afraid of losing my macho image.
It was a large, brightly lit room with a magnificent view, of which no one was taking the slightest notice. Beyond the wide window, which ran the whole length of one wall, a snow-flecked mountainside sloped down to a tiny alpine village more than a mile below. Despite the distance, every detail was crystal clear. Beyond the village, the ground rose again, more and more steeply, to the great mountain that dominated the skyline and trailed from its summit a perpetual plume of snow, a white streamer drifting forever with the wind. It was a wonderful panorama, and it was all an illusion. The Martins' flat was in the middle of London, and outside the walls a November fog was curling sluggishly through the damp streets. But Mrs. Martin had only to turn a switch, and the concealed projectors would give her any view she wished, together with the sounds that went with it. Television, which had brought so many pictures into every home, had made this inevitable, and in these opening years of the 21st century, most houses could have any scenery they pleased. Of course, it was rather expensive, but it was such a good way of letting the family get to know the world. Mrs. Martin looked round anxiously. At the moment, everything seemed a little too quiet for comfort. What she saw was reassuring. 18-year-old Daphne was tuned into Paris on the TV set, watching a fashion display. "Mother," she called out, "you must see this gorgeous scarlet cloak. I'd love one just like it." Michael, who was 15, was doing, "Rather wish I were going back with you," he said with a smile. But perhaps you understand now why I came here in the first place. When you've had time to sort yourselves out, write and tell me what you thought about the moon, won't you? And one other thing. Don't be too superior to all your friends when you do get back to Earth. Then the metal doors silently separated them, to open again a minute later into the cabin of the spaceship. To Daphne, it seemed incredible that only a fortnight ago she had entered this cabin for the first time on a distant world called Earth. So much had happened in those days. What she had seen here would colour all her life. She knew that nothing would ever seem quite the same to her again. Earth was no longer everything that mattered, no longer the centre of the universe. It was only one world among many, merely the first of the planets on which men had lived. One day, perhaps, it would not even seem the most important. The thunder of the rockets burst in upon her daydreams and brought her back to the present. She felt the thrust of increasing weight as she sank into her couch, and once again her limbs became suddenly like lead. The massed millions of horsepower safely chained by the gleaming instruments on the control board were taking her home, taking her away from the cold and silent beauty of the moon. The crater rings, the dark chasms, the great plains with their magic and mysterious names, all these were falling swiftly away beneath the climbing ship. In a few hours, the moon would be no more than a distant globe, dwindling in space. But one day, Daphne knew, she would return. This world, not Earth, would be her home. At last, she had found her ambition, although as yet she had breathed a word of it to no one. There would be years of study ahead, but in the end, she would join the quest for the secret of the stars. Her holiday was over.
Nemesis. First published in Super Science Stories, March 1950 as Exile of the Eons. Collected in Expedition to Earth.
Already the mountains were trembling with the thunder that only man can make. But here the war seemed very far away, for the full moon hung over the ageless Himalayas, unchanged forever. He had planned to wait 100 years. More than that he dared not delay, for when he awoke he would have to master all the changes in science and society that the passing years had wrought. Even a century might have altered the face of civilization beyond his understanding, but that was a risk he would have to take. Less than a century would not be safe, for the world would still be full of bitter memories. Sealed in a vacuum beneath the couch were 3 electronic counters operated by thermocouples hundreds of feet above on the eastern face of the mountain where no snow could ever cling. Every day the rising sun would operate them, and the counters would add 1 unit to their store. So the coming of dawn would be noted in the darkness where the master slept. When any one of the counters reached the total of 36,000, a switch would close and oxygen would flow back into the chamber. The temperature would rise, and the automatic hypodermic strapped to the master's arm would inject the calculated amount of fluid. He would awaken, and only the counters would tell him that the century had really passed. Then all he need do would be to press the button which would blast away the mountainside and give him free passage to the outer world. Everything had been considered. There could be no failure. All the machinery had been triplicated and was as perfect as science could contrive. The master's last thought, as consciousness ebbed, was not of his past life, nor of the mother whose hopes he had betrayed. Unbidden and unwelcome, there came into his mind the words of an ancient poet: "To sleep, perchance to dream." No, he would not, dared not dream. He would only sleep. 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 20 miles away, the battle was coming to its end. Not a dozen of the master's ships were left. fighting hopelessly against overwhelming fire. The action would have ended long ago had the attackers not been ordered to risk no ships in unnecessary adventures. The decision was to be left to the long-range artillery. So the great destroyers, the airborne battleships of this age, lay with their fighter screens in the shelter of the mountains, pouring salvo after salvo into the doomed formations. Aboard the flagship, a young Hindu gunnery officer set vernier dials with infinite accuracy and gently pressed a pedal with his foot. There was the faintest of shocks as the dirigible torpedoes left their cradles and hurled themselves at the enemy. The young Indian sat waiting tensely as the chronometer ticked off the seconds. This, he thought, was anguish. Trevendor rushed out into the desert and broke the chains binding him to that evil mind. It was night, and very still, for the earth was now too weary even for winds to blow. The darkness hid everything, but Trevendor knew that it could not hide the thoughts of that other mind with which he must now share the world. Once he had been alone, and he had imagined nothing more dreadful. But now he knew that there were things more fearful even than solitude. The stillness of the night and the glory of the stars that had once been his friends brought calm to the soul of Trevendor. Slowly he turned and retraced his footsteps, walking heavily, for he was about to perform a deed that no man of his kind had ever done before. The master was standing when Trevendor re-entered the sphere. Perhaps some hint of the other's purpose must have dawned upon his mind, for he was very pale and trembled with a weakness that was more than physical. Steadfastly, Trevendor forced himself to look once more into the master's brain. His mind recoiled at the chaos of conflicting emotions, now shot through with the sickening flashes of fear. Out of the maelstrom, one coherent thought came quavering. "What are you going to do? Why do you look at me like that?" Trevendor made no reply, holding his mind aloof from contamination while he marshaled his resolution and his strength. The tumult in the master's mind was rising to a crescendo. For a moment his mounting terror brought something akin to pity to the gentle spirit of Trevendor, and his will faltered. But then there came again the picture of those ruined and burning cities, and his indecision vanished. With all the power of his superhuman intellect, backed by thousands of centuries of mental evolution, he struck at the man before him. Into the master's mind, obliterating all else, flooded the single thought of death. For a moment the master stood motionless, his eyes staring wildly before him. His breath froze as his lungs ceased their work. In his veins the pulsing blood, which had been stilled for so long, now congealed forever. Without a sound, the master toppled and lay still. Very slowly, Trevendor turned and walked out into the night. Like a shroud, the silence and loneliness of the world descended upon him. The sand, thwarted so long, began to drift through the open portals of the master's tomb.
Time's Arrow. First published in Science Fantasy, summer 1950. Collected in Reach for Tomorrow.
Time's Arrow is an example of how hard it is for the science fiction writer to keep ahead of fact. The quite, at the time, imaginary discovery described in the tale now actually exists, and may be seen in the New York Natural History Museum. I think it most unlikely, however, that the rest will come true.
The river was dead, and the lake already dying when the monster had come down the dried-up watercourse and turned onto the desolate mudflats. There were not many places where it was safe to walk, and even where the ground was hardest, the great pistons of its feet sank a foot or more beneath the weight they carried. Sometimes it had paused, surveying the landscape with quick, bird-like movements of its head. Then it had sunk even deeper into the yielding soil, so that 50 million years later, men could judge with some accuracy the duration of its halts. For the waters had never returned, and the blazing sun had baked the mud to rock. Later still, the desert had poured over all this land, sealing it beneath protecting layers of sand. And later, very much later, had come man. Do you think, shouted Barton above the din, that Professor Fowler became a paleontologist because he likes playing with pneumatic drills? Or did he acquire the taste afterward? Can't hear you, yelled Davis, leaning on his shovel in a most professional manner. He glanced hopefully at his watch. Shall I tell him it's dinner time? He can't wear a watch while he's drilling, so he won't know any better. I doubt if it'll work, Barton shrieked. He's got wise to us now and always adds an extra 10 minutes. But it will make a change from this infernal digging. With noticeable enthusiasm, the two geologists downed tools and started to walk toward their chief. As they approached, he shut off the drill, and relative silence descended, broken only by the throbbing of the compressor in the background. About time we went back to camp, Professor, said Davis, wristwatch held casually behind his back. You know what Cook says if we're late. Professor Fowler, M.A., F.R.S., F.G.S., mopped some, but by no means all, of the ochre dust from his forehead. He would have passed anywhere as a typical navvy, and the occasional visitors to the site seldom recognized the vice president of the Geological Society in the brawny, half-naked workman crouching over his beloved pneumatic drill. It had taken nearly a month to clear the sandstone down to the surface of the petrified mud flats. In that time, several hundred square feet had been exposed, revealing a frozen snapshot of the past that was probably the finest yet discovered by paleontology. Some score of birds, and he waited until his strength returned. Then, half running, he went unsteadily down the hill to rejoin his friend. Barton was half sitting in the trench, with his head buried in his hands. He looked up as Davis approached, and although his features were obscured by dust and sand, the other was shocked at the expression in his eyes. "So you heard it too," Davis said. "I think the whole lab's blown up. Come along, for heaven's sake." Heard what?" said Barton dully. Davis stared at him in amazement. Then he realized that Barton could not possibly have heard any sound while he was working with the drill. The sense of disaster deepened with a rush. He felt like a character in some Greek tragedy, helpless before an implacable doom. Barton rose to his feet. His face was working strangely, and Davis saw that he was on the verge of a breakdown. Yet when he spoke, his words were surprisingly calm. "What fools we were," he said. "How Henderson must have laughed at us when we told him that he was trying to see into the past." Mechanically, Davis moved to the trench and stared at the rock that was seeing the light of day for the first time in 50 million years. Without much emotion now, he traced again the zigzag pattern he had first noticed a few hours before. It had sunk only a little way into the mud, as if when it was formed, the jeep had been traveling at its utmost speed. No doubt it had been, for in one place, the shallow tire marks had been completely obliterated by the monster's footprints. They were now very deep indeed, as if the great reptile was about to make the final leap upon its desperately fleeing prey.
Trouble with the Natives. Originally published in Lilliput, February 1951 as 3 Men in a Flying Saucer, collected in Reach for Tomorrow.
The flying saucer came down vertically through the clouds, braked to a halt about 50 feet from the ground, and settled with a considerable bump on a patch of heather-strewn moorland. "That," said Captain Wixstafil, "was a lousy landing." He did not, of course, use precisely these words. To human ears, his remarks would have sounded rather like the clucking of an angry hen. Master pilot Clarke unwound 3 of his tentacles from the control panel, stretched all 4 of his legs, and relaxed comfortably. "Not my fault the automatics have packed up again," he grumbled. "But what do you expect with a ship that should have been scrapped 5,000 years ago? Composed entirely of iron bars." "Now don't worry," said P.C. Hinks. "Everything will be quite all right. I'll be back in a minute." Christille and Danster gazed at each other with a surmise that rapidly deepened into a dreadful certainty. "We're locked in. This is a prison. Now what are we going to do?" "I don't know if you chaps understand English," said a languid voice from the gloom, but you might let a fellow sleep in peace. For the first time, the two prisoners saw that they were not alone. Lying on a bed in the corner of the cell was a somewhat dilapidated young man who gazed at them blearily out of one resentful eye. "My goodness," said Danster nervously. "Do you suppose he's a dangerous criminal?" "He doesn't look very dangerous at the moment," said Christille with more accuracy than he guessed. "What are you in for, anyway?" asked the stranger, sitting up unsteadily. "You look as if you'd been to a fancy dress party." "Oh, my poor head." He collapsed again into the prone position. "Fancy locking up anyone as ill as this," said Danster, who was a kind-hearted individual. Then he continued in English. "I don't know why we're here. We just told the policeman who we were and where we came from, and this is what happened." "Well, who are you?" "We've just landed." "Oh, there's no point in going into all that again," interrupted Christille. "We'll never get anyone to believe us." "Hey," said the stranger, sitting up once more. "What language is that you're speaking? I know a few, but I've never heard anything like that." "Oh, all right," Christille said to Danster. "You might as well tell him. There's nothing else to do until that policeman comes back anyway." At this moment, P.C. Hinks was engaged in an earnest conversation with the superintendent of the local mental home, who insisted stoutly that all his patients were present. However, a careful check was promised, and he called back later. Wondering if the whole thing was a practical joke, P.C. Hinks put the receiver down and quietly made his way to the cells. The three prisoners seemed to be engaged in friendly conversation, so he tiptoed away again. It would do them all good to have a chance to cool down. He rubbed his eye tenderly as he remembered what a battle it had been to get Mr. Graham into the cell during the small hours of the morning. That young man was now reasonably sober after the night's celebrations, which he did not in the least regret. It was, after all, quite an occasion when your degree came through and you found you'd got honors when you'd barely expected a pass. But he began to fear that he was still under the influence as Danster unfolded his tale and waited, not expecting grave misgivings. Christille and Danster climbed into the back of the incredibly ramshackle Bentley which Graham affectionately addressed as Rose. But there was nothing wrong with the engine under the rusty bonnet, and soon they were roaring out of Little Milton at 50 miles an hour. It was a striking demonstration of the relativity of speed. For Christille and Danster, who had spent the last few years traveling tranquilly through space at several million miles a second, had never been so scared in their lives. When Christille had recovered his breath, he pulled out his little portable transmitter and called the ship. "We're on the way back," he shouted above the roar of the wind. "We've got a fairly intelligent human being with us. Expect us in... I'm sorry, we just went over a bridge. About 10 minutes. What was that? No, of course not. We didn't have the slightest trouble. Everything went perfectly smoothly. Goodbye." Graham looked back only once to see how his passengers were faring. The sight was rather unsettling, for their ears and hair, which had not been glued on very firmly, had blown away, and their real selves were beginning to emerge. Graham began to suspect, with some discomfort, that his new acquaintances also lacked noses. Oh, well, one could grow used to anything with practice. He was going to have plenty of that in the years ahead. The rest, of course, you all know. But the full story of the first landing on Earth, and of the peculiar circumstances under which Ambassador Graham became humanity's representative to the universe at large, has never before been recounted. We extracted the main details, with a good deal of persuasion, from Christille and Danster themselves, while we were working on the Department of Extraterrestrial Affairs. It was understandable, in view of their success on Earth, that they should have been selected by their superiors to make the first contact with our mysterious and secretive neighbors, the Martians. It is also understandable, in the light of the above evidence, that Christille and Danster were so reluctant to embark on this later mission, and we are not really very surprised that nothing has ever been heard of them since.
Earthlight, first published in Thrilling Wonder Stories, August 1951. Not previously collected in book form.
I am very proud of the fact that the Apollo 15 crew gave this name to a crater which they drove past in their lunar rover. On their return to Earth, they sent me a beautiful 3D map bearing the inscription, "To Arthur Clarke, with best personal regards, from the crew of Apollo 15, and many thanks for your visions in space."
If it weren't for the fact, said Conrad Wheeler morosely, that it might be considered disrespectful, I'd say that the old man is completely nuts, and not just slightly touched like the rest of the people I've met on the moon. He looked balefully at Sid Jameson, 2 years his senior on the staff of the observatory. The latter grinned good-naturedly and refused to rise to the bait. Well, when you've known the old man as long as I have, he said, you'll realize he doesn't do anything like this without a very good reason. It had better be good. My series of spectrograms was supposed to be finished tonight, and now look at the scope. The giant dome that housed the 1,000-inch reflector was a shambles, or so a casual visitor would have thought. Even the natives were somewhat appalled by the confusion. A small army of technicians was gathered round the base of the great telescope, which was now pointing aimlessly at the zenith. Aimlessly because the dome of the observatory was closed and sealed against the outer vacuum. It was strange to see men unprotected by spacesuits walking over the tessellated floor, to hear voices ringing where normally no slightest sound could be heard. High up on a balcony on the far side of the dome, the director was giving orders into a microphone. His voice, enormously amplified, roared from the speakers that had been specially installed for the occasion. "Mirror crew, stand clear." There was a scurrying round the base of the telescope, then an expectant pause. "Lower away." With infinite slowness, the great disk of quartz that had cost $100 million to make was lowered from its cell to the strange vehicle beneath the telescope. The 90-foot-wide truck sank visibly on its scores of tiny balloon tires as it took up the weight of the immense mirror. Then the hoisting gear was released, and with a purr of motors, the truck and its precious cargo began to move slowly down the ramp leading to the resurfacing room. It was a breathtaking sight. The men scattered over the floor were utterly dwarfed by the lattice work of the telescope, towering hundreds of feet above them. And the mirror itself, over 80 feet in diameter, seemed like a lake of fire as it reflected the glare of overhead lights. When at last it had left the room, it was as though dusk had suddenly fallen. "And now they've got to put it back," grunted Wheeler. "I suppose that'll take even longer." "That's right," said his companion cheerfully. "Much longer. Why, last time we resurfaced the mirror," the amplifiers drowned his voice. 4 hours, 26 minutes, remarked the director in a 50-watt aside. "Not too bad. Okay, get her back and carry on." There was a click as he switched off the microphone. In a strained and hostile silence, the observatory staff watched his smokily known as caterpillars, or, more briefly, cats. They were really small spaceships mounted on broad tracks that enabled them to go anywhere within reason, even over the appallingly jagged surface of the moon. On fairly smooth terrain, they could do up to 80 miles an hour, but normally they were lucky to manage half that speed. The low gravity enabled them to climb fantastic slopes, and they could, if necessary, haul themselves out of vertical pits by means of their built-in winches. One could live in the larger models for months at a time in reasonable comfort. Jameson was a more than expert driver and knew the road down the mountains perfectly. As lunar highways went, it was one of the best and carried a good deal of traffic between the observatory and the port of Aristillus. And nevertheless, for the first hour, Wheeler felt that his hair would never lie down again. It usually took newcomers to the moon a long time to realize that slopes of 1 in 1 were perfectly safe if treated with respect. Perhaps it was just as well that Wheeler was a novice, for Jameson's technique was so unorthodox that it would have filled a more experienced passenger with real alarm. Why Jameson was such a desperate driver was a paradox that had caused much discussion among his colleagues. Normally he was painstaking and careful, even languid in his movements. No one had ever seen him really annoyed or excited. Many people thought him lazy, but that was a libel. He would spend weeks working out a theory until it was absolutely watertight, and then would put it away for 2 or 3 months to have another look at it later. Yet, once at the controls of a cat, this quiet and peace-loving astronomer became a daredevil driver who held the unofficial record for almost every tractor drive in the Northern Hemisphere. More than likely, the explanation lay in the boyhood desire to be a spaceship pilot. a dream that had been foiled by physical disability. They shot down the last foothills of the Alps and put into the Sea of Rains like a miniature avalanche. Now that they were on lower ground, Wheeler began to breathe again, thankful to have left the vertiginous slopes behind. He was not so pleased when, with a colossal crash, Jameson drove the tractor off the road and out into the barren plain. "Hey, where you going?" he cried. Jameson laughed at his consternation. "This is where the rough stuff begins. The road goes southwest to Aristillas here, and we want to get to Pico. So from now on, we're in country where only half a dozen tractors have ever been before. To cheer you up, I might say Ferdinand is one of them." Ferdinand was now plunging ahead at 20 miles an hour with a swaying motion Wheeler found rather disconcerting. If he had lived in an age that had known of ships, he might have been familiar with it. The view was disappointing, as it always is at sea level on the moon, owing to the nearness of the horizon. Pico and all the more distant mountains had sunk below the skyline, and the plain ahead looked uninviting as it lay in the blazing sun. For 3 hours they forged steadily across it, passing tiny craterlets and yawning crevasses that seemed of indefinite depth. The rockets never reached the surface of the moon. They were still many miles up when simultaneously they exploded. 4 enormous spheres of light blossomed among the stars and vanished. Automatically, Wheeler braced himself for the concussion that could never come in the vacuum around him. Something strange had happened to the dome. At first, Wheeler thought that it had grown in size. Then he realized that the dome itself had gone, and in its place was a wavering hemisphere of light scarcely visible to the eye. It was like nothing he had ever seen before. It was equally unfamiliar to the Federation ships. In a matter of seconds, they had dwindled into space, shrinking under the drive of an inconceivable acceleration. They were taking no chances while they went into conference and hastily checked the armament they had never imagined they would have to use. Rather late in the day, they understood the reason for Earth's quiet confidence. They were gone only a brief while. Although they had disappeared together, they returned from entirely different directions, as if to confuse the defenses of the mine. The 2 cruisers came down at steep angles from opposite corners of the sky, and the battleship swept up over the horizon behind the screen of Pico, where it remained for the earlier part of the conflict. Suddenly, the cruisers vanished, as the dome had vanished, behind wavering spheres of light. But these spheres were already brilliant, shining with a strange orange glow. Wheeler realized that they must be radiation screens of some kind, and as he looked again towards the mine, he knew that the onslaught had begun. The hemisphere on the plain was blazing with all the colors of the rainbow, and its brilliance was increasing second by second. Power was being poured into it from outside, power that was being converted into the harmless rays of the visible spectrum. That, at least, was clear to Wheeler. He wondered how many millions of horsepower were flowing invisibly through the space between the cruisers and the mine. It was already far brighter than day. Slowly, understanding came to him. The rays which the 20th century had imagined but never known were a myth no longer. Not like the spaceship, gradually and over many years had they come upon the world. In secrecy, during the 70 years of peace, they had been conceived and brought to perfection. The dome on the plain was a fortress, such a one as no earlier man had ever dreamed of before. Its defenses must have gone into action immediately the first beams of the enemy reacted upon them, but for many minutes it made no attempt at retaliation. Nor yet was it in any position to do so, for under the blazing shield that protected them, Fletcher and his colleagues were fighting time as well as the Federation. Then Wheeler noticed a faint brush discharge on either side of the dome. That was all. But the screens of the cruisers turned cherry red, then blue-white, then a color he knew but had never thought to see on any world, the violet little pits of flame that looked as if they had been carved from the sun. The summit of the mountain had been caught in those beams. It did not have time to melt. The peak vanished, and only a ragged, smoking plateau was left. Wheeler was going to risk no further damage to his eyes, which were already paining him. With a word of explanation to Jameson, he raced back to the tractor and returned a few minutes later with a set of heavy-duty filters. The relief was immense. No longer were the screens of the cruisers like artificial suns, and they could look once more in the direction of the fortress. Though he could see only the ray shields against which the beams of the battleships were still splashing in vain, it seemed to Wheeler that the hemisphere had lost its original symmetry during the battle. At first he thought one of the generators might have failed. Then he saw that the lake of lava was at least a mile across, and he knew that the whole fort had floated off its foundations. Probably the defenders were scarcely aware of the fact. Their installation was taking care of solar heat and would hardly notice molten rock. And now, a strange thing was beginning to happen. The rays with which the battle was being fought were no longer quite invisible, for the fortress was no longer in a vacuum. Around it, the boiling rock was releasing enormous volumes of gas, through which the paths of the rays were as clearly visible as searchlights on Earth on a misty night. At the same time, Wheeler began to notice a continual hail of tiny particles around him. For a moment he was puzzled. Then he realized that the rock vapor was condensing after it had been blasted up into the sky. It seemed too light to be dangerous, and he did not mention it to Jameson. As long as it was not too heavy, the insulation of the spacesuits could deal with it. Accustomed though they were to the eternal silences of the moon, both men felt a sense of unreality at the sight of those tremendous weapons blasting overhead without a whisper of sound. Now and then there would be a hammer blow underfoot as a torpedo crashed, deflected by the fields of the fort. But most of the time there was absolute silence, even when there were half a dozen rockets detonating in the sky at once. It was like watching a television program when the sound had failed. They never knew why the fortress waited so long before it used its main weapon. Possibly Fletcher could not get it into action earlier, or perhaps he was waiting for the attack to slacken so that some energy could be diverted from the screens. For it was during a lull in the engagement that the Polaron beam operated for the first time in history. The two watchers saw it strike upward like an inverted lightning flash. It was clearly visible along its whole length, not merely in patches where it passed through dust and gas. Even in that brief second of time, Wheeler noticed this staggering violation of the laws of optics and wondered at its implications. Not until many years later did he learn how a polaron beam radiates some of its energy at right angles to its direction of propagation so that it can be seen even in a vacuum. The beam, they might have won. Then he turned toward the blinding disk of Earth, breathtakingly lovely beneath its belts of clouds. The future might belong to the Federation, but almost all that it possessed it had inherited from the mother world. How could one choose between the two? He shrugged his shoulders. There was nothing he could do about it now. Resolutely, he turned toward the north and walked forward to receive the fame from which he would never escape.
Hide and Seek. First published in Astounding Science Fiction, September 1949. Collected in Expedition to Earth.
We were walking back through the woods when Kingman saw the gray squirrel. Our bag was a small but varied one. 3 grouse, 4 rabbits, one, I am sorry to say, an infant in arms, and a couple of pigeons. And contrary to certain dark forecasts, both the dogs were still alive. The squirrel saw us at the same moment. It knew that it was marked for immediate execution as a result of the damage it had done to the trees on the estate, and perhaps it had lost close relatives to Kingman's gun. In 3 leaps it had reached the base of the nearest tree and vanished behind it in a flicker of grey. We saw its face once more, appearing for a moment round the edge of its shield, a dozen feet from the ground. But though we waited, with guns levelled hopefully at various branches, we never saw it again. Kingman was very thoughtful as we walked back across the lawn to the magnificent old house. He said nothing as we handed our victims to the cook, who received them without much enthusiasm, and only emerged from his reverie when we were sitting in the smoking room, and he remembered his duties as a host. "That tree rat," he said suddenly. He always called them tree rats, on the ground that people were too sentimental to shoot the dear little squirrels. "It reminded me of a very peculiar experience that happened shortly before I retired. Very shortly indeed, in fact." "I thought it would," said Carson dryly. I gave him a glare. He'd been in the Navy and had heard Kingman's stories before, but they were still new to me. "Of course," Kingman remarked, slightly nettled, "if you'd rather I didn't." "Do go on," I said hastily. "You've made me curious. What connection there can possibly be between a grey squirrel and the Second Jovian War, I can't imagine." Kingman seemed mollified. "At last, thankful to leave, even in defeat, this miserable lump of rock that had so annoyingly balked her of her legitimate prey. K-15 knew what had happened, and a great sense of peace and relaxation swept over him. In the radar room of the cruiser, someone had seen an echo of disconcerting amplitude approaching with altogether excessive speed. K-15 now had only to switch on his suit beacon and to wait. He could even afford the luxury of a cigarette. "Quite an interesting story," I said, "and I see now how it ties up with that squirrel. But it does raise one or two queries in my mind." "Indeed?" said Rupert Kingman politely. I always like to get to the bottom of things, and I knew that my host had played a dart in the Jovian War, about which he seldom spoke. I decided to risk a long shot in the dark. "May I ask you how you happen to know so much about this unorthodox military engagement? It isn't possible, is it, that you were K-15? There was an odd sort of strangling noise from Carson. Then Kingman said, quite calmly, "No, I wasn't." He got to his feet and went off towards the gun room. "If you'll excuse me a moment, I'm going to have another shot at that tree rat. Maybe I'll get him this time." Then he was gone. Carson looked at me as if to say, "This is another house you'll never be invited to again." When our host was out of earshot, he remarked in a coldly clinical voice, "You've torn it. What did you have to say that for?" Well, it seemed a safe guess. How else could he have known all that? As a matter of fact, I believe he met K-15 after the war. They must have had an interesting conversation together. But I thought you knew that Rupert was retired from the service with only the rank of lieutenant commander. The court of inquiry could never see his point of view. After all, it just wasn't reasonable that the commander of the fastest ship in the fleet couldn't catch a man in a spacesuit.
The Road to the Sea, first published in 2 complete science adventure books, spring 1951, as Seeker. He returned with interest. Their skins were much darker than his, he noticed, and their voices were softer and less modulated. Some of them even had a trace of accent, for despite a universal language and instantaneous communication, regional variations still existed. At least, Brant assumed that they were the ones with accents, but once or twice he caught them smiling a little as he spoke. Throughout the morning, the visitors gathered in the square and made their way to the great arena that had been ruthlessly carved out of the forest. There were tents and bright banners here, and much shouting and laughter, for the morning was for the amusement of the young. Though Athens had swept like a dwindling but never-dying beacon for 10,000 years down the river of time, the pattern of sport had scarcely changed since those first Olympic days. Men still ran and jumped and wrestled and swam, but they did all these things a good deal better now than their ancestors. Brant was a fair sprinter over short distances, and managed to finish third in the 100 meters. His time was just over 8 seconds, which was not very good, because the record was less than 7. Brant would have been much amazed to learn that there was a time when no one in the world could have approached this figure. John enjoyed himself hugely, bouncing youths even larger than himself into the patient turf, and when the morning's results were added up, Caldus had scored more points than any of the visitors, although it had been first in relatively few events. As noon approached, the crowd began to flow amoeba-like down to 5 Oaks Glade, where the molecular synthesizers had been working since the early hours to cover hundreds of tables with food. Much skill had gone into preparing the prototypes, which were being reproduced with absolute fidelity down to the last atom. For though the mechanics of food production had altered completely, The art of the chef had survived, and had even gone forward to victories in which nature played no part at all. The main feature of the afternoon was a long poetic drama, a pastiche put together with considerable skill from the works of poets whose very names had been forgotten ages since. On the whole, Brant found it boring, though there were some fine lines here and there that had stuck in his memory. For winter's rains and ruins are over, and all the season of snows and sins. Brant knew about snow, and was glad to have left it behind. Sin, however, was an archaic word that had dropped out of use 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, taking his inspiration from nature, but he never copied what he saw. When one of his pictures was finished, which occasionally happened, the title was often the only clue to the original source. The music of the dance still throbbed around him, but he had lost all interest. The sight of other people enjoying themselves was more than he could stand. He decided to get away from the crowd, and the only peaceful place he could think of was down by the river, at the end of the shining carpet of freshly planted glow moss that led through the wood. He sat at the water's edge, throwing twigs into the current and watching them drift downstream. From time to time other idlers strolled by, but they were usually in pairs and took no notice of him. He watched them enviously and brooded over the unsatisfactory state of his affairs. It would almost be better, he thought, if Ariadne did make up her mind to choose John, and so put him out of his misery. But she showed not the slightest sign of preferring one to the other. Perhaps she was simply enjoying herself at their expense, as some people, particularly old Johann, maintained, though it was just as likely that she was genuinely unable to choose. What was wanted, Brant thought morosely, was for one of them to do something really spectacular which the other could not hope to match. "Hello," said a small voice behind him. He twisted around and looked over his shoulder. A little girl of 8 or so was staring at him, with her head slightly on one side, like an inquisitive sparrow. "Hello," he replied without enthusiasm. "Why aren't you watching the dance?" "Why aren't you in it?" she replied promptly. "I'm tired," he said, hoping that this was an adequate excuse. "You shouldn't be running around by yourself. You might get lost." "I am lost," she replied happily, sitting down on the bank beside him. "I like it that way." Brant wondered which of the other villages she had come from. She was quite a pretty little thing, but would look prettier with less chocolate on her face. It seemed that his solitude was at an end. She stared at him with that disconcerting directness which, perhaps fortunately, seldom survives childhood. "I know what's the matter with you," she said suddenly. "Indeed?" queried Brant with polite skepticism. "You're in love." Brant dropped the twig he was about to throw, desire to clutter up his well-organized mind with irrelevancies, and to him the whole story of the rise and fall of the great cities was a historical digression of no particular importance. It was an interesting, if a regrettable, episode, and it belonged to a past that had irretrievably vanished. Brant was still waiting patiently when he emerged, looking very wise. "I couldn't find any pictures," he said. "My wife has been tidying up again, but I'll tell you what I can remember about Shastar." Brant settled himself down as comfortably as he could. He was likely to be here for some time. Shastar was one of the very last cities that man ever built. You know, of course, that cities arose quite late in human culture, only about 12,000 years ago. They grew in number and importance for several thousand years, until at last there were some containing millions of people. It is very hard for us to imagine what it must have been like to live in such places. Deserts of steel and stone, with not even a blade of grass for miles. But they were necessary. before transport and communication had been perfected, and people had to live near each other to carry out all the intricate operations of trade and manufacture upon which their lives depended. Now, the really great cities began to disappear when air transport became universal. The threat of attack in those far-off, barbarous days also helped to disperse them. But for a long time, "I've studied the history of that period," interjected Brant, not very truthfully. "I know all about. For a long time, there were still many small cities which were held together by cultural rather than commercial links. They had populations a few score thousand and lasted for centuries after the passing of the giants. That's why Oxford and Princeton and Heidelberg still mean something to us, while far larger cities are no more than names. But even these were doomed when the invention of the integrator made it possible for any community, however small, to manufacture without effort everything it needed for civilized living. Shastar was built when there was no longer any need technically for cities, but before people realized that the culture of cities was coming to its end. It seems to have been a conscious work of art, conceived and designed as a whole, and those who lived there were mostly artists of some kind. But it didn't last very long. What finally killed it was the Exodus. Simon became smaller than by night, though it was impressive enough. It was colored, Brant saw for the first time, a rich autumnal gold, the color of no natural rock. He knew from this that it did not belong, as he had half suspected, to any prehistoric culture. It had been built by science from some inconceivably stubborn synthetic substance, and Brant guessed that its creation must lie almost midway in time between him and the fabulous original which had inspired it. Slowly, half afraid of what he might discover, he turned his back upon the Sphinx and looked to the north. The hill fell away at his feet, and the road went sweeping down the long slope as if impatient to greet the sea. And there, at its end, lay Shastar. It caught the sunlight and tossed it back to him, tinted with all the colors of its maker's dreams. The spacious buildings lining the wide streets seemed unravished by time. The great band of marble that held the sea at bay was still unbreached. The parks and gardens, though long overgrown with weeds, were not yet jungles. The city followed the curve of the bay for perhaps 2 miles, and stretched half that distance inland. By the standards of the past, it was very small indeed, but to Brant it seemed enormous, a maze of streets and squares, intricate beyond unraveling. Then he began to discern the underlying symmetry of its design, to pick out the main thoroughfares, and to see the skill with which its makers had avoided both monotony and discord. For a long time Brant stood motionless on the hilltop, conscious only of the wonder spread beneath his eyes. He was alone in all that landscape, a tiny figure lost and humble before the achievements of greater men. The sense of history, the vision of the long slope up which man had been toiling for 1,000,000 years or more, was almost overwhelming. In that moment, it seemed to Brant that from his hilltop he was looking over time rather than space, and in his ears there whispered the soughing of the winds of eternity as they swept into the past. Sunbeam seemed very nervous as they approached the outskirts of the city. She had never seen anything like this before in her life, and Brant could not help sharing her disquiet. However unimaginative one may be, there is something ominous about buildings that have been deserted for centuries, and those of Shastar had been empty for the better part of 5,000 years. Could ever understand. It seemed unfair that this should have happened in his time, after all these centuries of rest. But men cannot bargain with fate, and choose peace or adventure as they wish. Adventure and change had come to the world again, and he must make the best of it. as his ancestors had done when the age of space had opened and their first frail ships had stormed the stars. For the last time he saluted Shastar, then turned his back upon the sea. The sun was shining in his eyes, and the road before him seemed veiled with a bright, shimmering mist, so that it quivered like a mirage, or the track of the moon upon troubled waters. For a moment Brant wondered if his eyes had been deceiving him. Then he saw it was no illusion. As far as the eye could see, the road and the land on either side of it were draped with countless strands of gossamer, so frail and fine that only the glancing sunlight revealed their presence. For the last quarter mile he had been walking through them, and they had resisted his passage no more than coils of smoke. Throughout the morning the wind-borne spiders must have been falling in millions from the sky, and as he stared up into the blue, Brant could still catch momentary glimpses of sunlight upon drifting silk as belated voyagers went sailing by. Not knowing whither they would travel, these tiny creatures had ventured forth into an abyss more friendless and more fathomless than any he would face when the time came to say farewell to Earth. It was a lesson he would remember in the weeks and months ahead. Slowly, the Sphinx sank into the skyline as it joined Shastar beyond the eclipsing crescent of the hills. Only once did Brant look back at the crouching monster, whose age-long vigil was now drawing to its close. Then he walked slowly forward into the sun, while ever and again impalpable fingers brushed his face, as the strands of silk came drifting down the wind that blew from home.
The Sentinel, first published in 10-story fantasy, spring 1951, as Sentinel of Eternity, collected in Expedition to Earth.
The Sentinel was written over Christmas 1948 for a BBC competition. It wasn't even placed. I have often wondered what did win. I am amused to see that I put the exploration of the Mare Crisium in the late summer of 1996. Well, we missed that date, but I hope we'll get there early in the next century. This is the starting point of 2001, A Space Odyssey.
The next time you see the full moon high in the south, look carefully at its right-hand edge and let your eye travel upwards along the curve of the disk. Round about 2 o'clock, you will notice a small dark oval. Anyone with normal eyesight can find it quite easily. It is the great walled plain, one of the finest on the moon, known as the Mare Crisium, the Sea of Crises, 300 miles in diameter, and almost completely surrounded by a ring of magnificent mountains. It had never been explored until we entered it in the late summer of 1996. Our expedition was a large one. We had 2 heavy freighters, which had flown our supplies and equipment from the main lunar base in the Mare Serenitatis, 500 miles away. There were also 3 small rockets, which were intended for short-range transport over regions which our surface vehicles could not cross. Luckily, most of the Mare Crisium is very flat. There are none of the great crevasses so common and so dangerous elsewhere, and very few craters or mountains of any size. As far as we could tell, our powerful Caterpillar tractors would have no difficulty in taking us wherever we wished. I was geologist, or selenologist, if you want to be pedantic, in charge of the group exploring the southern region of the Mare. We had crossed 100 miles of it in a week, skirting the foothills of the mountains along the shore of what was once the ancient sea, some 1,000 million years before. When life was beginning on Earth, it was already dying here. The waters were retreating down the flanks of those stupendous cliffs, retreating into the empty heart of the moon. Over the land which we were crossing, the tideless ocean had once been half a mile deep, And now the only trace of moisture was the hoar frost one could sometimes find in caves, which the searing sunlight never penetrated. We had begun our journey early in the slow lunar dawn, and still had almost a week of Earth time before nightfall. Half a dozen times a day we would leave our vehicle and go outside in the spacesuits to hunt for interesting minerals, or to place markers for the guidance of future travelers. On the moon, of course, there is no loss of detail with distance, none of that almost imperceptible haziness which softens and sometimes transfigures all far-off things on Earth. Those mountains were 10,000 feet high, and they climbed steeply out of the plain, as if ages ago some subterranean eruption had smashed them skywards through the molten crust. The base of even the nearest was hidden from sight by the steeply curving surface of the plain, for the moon is a very little world, and from where I was standing, the horizon was only 2 miles away. I lifted my eyes towards the peaks which no man had ever climbed, the peaks which, before the coming of terrestrial life, had watched the retreating oceans sink sullenly into their graves, taking with them the hope and the morning promise of a world. The sunlight was beating against those ramparts with a glare that hurt the eyes, yet only a little way above them the stars were shining steadily in a sky blacker than a winter midnight on Earth. I was turning away when my eye caught a metallic glitter high on the ridge of a great promontory, thrusting out into the sea 30 miles to the west. It was a dimensionless point of light, as if a star had been clawed from the sky by one of those cruel peaks, and I imagined that some smooth rock surface was catching the sunlight and heliographing it straight into my eyes. Such things were not uncommon. When the moon is in her second quarter, observers on Earth can sometimes see the great ranges in the Oceanus Procellarum burning with a blue-white iridescence as the sunlight flashes from their slopes and leaps again from world to world. But I was curious to know what kind of rock could be shining so brightly up there, and I climbed into the observation turret and swung our 4-inch telescope round to the west. I could see just enough to tantalize me. Clear and sharp in the field of vision, the mountain peaks seemed only half a mile away. But whatever was catching the sunlight was still too small to be resolved. Yet it seemed to have an elusive symmetry, and the summit upon which it rested was curiously flat. I stared for a long time at that glittering enigma, straining my eyes into space, until presently a smell of burning from the galley told me that our breakfast sausages had made their 250,000-mile journey in vain. All that morning we argued our way across the Mare Crisium while the western mountains reared higher in the sky. Even when we were out prospecting in the spacesuits, the discussion would continue over the radio. It was absolutely certain, my companions argued, that there had never been any begin. Those wanderers must have looked on Earth, circling safely in the narrow zone between fire and ice, and must have guessed that it was the favorite of the sun's children. Here in the distant future would be intelligence, but there were countless stars before them still, and they might never come this way again. So they left a sentinel, one of millions they have scattered throughout the universe, watching over all worlds with the promise of life. It was a beacon that down the ages has been patiently signaling the fact that no one had discovered it. Perhaps you understand now why that crystal pyramid was set upon the moon instead of on the Earth. Its builders were not concerned with races still struggling up from savagery. They would be interested in our civilization only if we proved our fitness to survive by crossing space and so escaping from the Earth, our cradle. That is the challenge that all intelligent races must meet sooner or later. It is a double challenge, for it depends in turn upon the conquest of atomic energy and the last choice between life and death. Once we had passed that crisis, it was only a matter of time before we found the pyramid and forced it open. Now its signals have ceased, and those whose duty it is will be turning their minds upon Earth. Perhaps they wish to help our infant civilization. but they must be very, very old, and the old are often insanely jealous of the young. I can never look now at the Milky Way without wondering from which of those banked clouds of stars the emissaries are coming. If you will pardon so commonplace a simile, we have broken the glass of the fire alarm and have nothing to do but to wait. I do not think we will have to wait for long.
According to my indefatigable bibliographer, David Samuelson, my first attempts at fiction appeared in the Hewish magazine for autumn 1932. I was then on the editorial board of the school journal, which is presided over by our English master, Captain E.B. Mitford, to whom I later dedicated my collection, The 9 Billion Names of God. My contributions were letters purporting to be from old boys working in exotic environments which clearly had science fictional inspiration. But what is science fiction of previous history? Inevitably, some of them have been dated by events. However, I've resisted all temptations for retrospective editing. To put matters in perspective, roughly a third of these stories were written when most people believed that talk of spaceflight was complete lunacy. By the time the last dozen were written, men had walked on the moon. By mapping out possible futures, as well as a good many improbable ones, the science fiction writer does a great service to the community. He encourages in his readers flexibility of mind, readiness to accept, and even welcome change. In one word, adaptability. Perhaps no attribute is more important in this age. The dinosaurs disappeared because they could not adapt to their changing environment. We shall disappear if we cannot adapt to an environment that now contains spaceships, computers, and thermonuclear weapons. Nothing could be more ridiculous, therefore, than the accusation sometimes made against science fiction that it is escapist. That charge can indeed be made against much fantasy, but so what? There are times, this century has provided a more than ample supply, when some form of escapism is essential, and any art form that supplies it is not to be despised. And as C.S. Lewis, creator of both superb science fiction and fantasy, once remarked to me, who are the people most opposed to escapism? Jailers. C.P. Snow ended his famous essay, Science and Government, by stressing the vital importance of the gift of foresight. He pointed out that men often have wisdom without possessing foresight. Science fiction has done much to redress the balance. Even if its writers do not always possess wisdom, the best ones have certainly possessed foresight, and that is an even greater gift from the gods.